Welcome to Books in Five, where we are interviewing authors of recently published books on relevant topics. I'm very excited because I have Daniel McDowell here with us today. Daniel, just give us an introduction of who you are and where you are working out of today.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here and appreciate you inviting me on the podcast. So I'm a professor of political science at Syracuse University. I'm in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse. I'm also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center. So I'm at home just outside of Syracuse today and looking forward to our conversation.
Great, let's jump right into it with our first question here. Let's set the table with regard to the primacy of the US dollar in the world economy. Walk us through the numbers as other nations are heavily reliant on the American currency.
Yeah, and this is an important starting point. It's something that a lot of people, especially Americans, may not really think about that much, and that is the fact that the dollar is not only the currency of the United States. It's the currency that if you live in the United States, you're interacting with and using when you're buying goods and services. But it's also functions largely as the currency of the world economy as well. And it turns out the world economy functions best when there are, say, one or two or three relatively small number of currencies that perform the basic functions of money at the global level. And so what are we talking about? We talk about the functions of money. We're talking about the medium of exchange role. What are we using when we're exchanging goods to settle or pay for those goods and services? Unit of account role. How do we price the things that we want to buy and sell? And then lastly, the store of value role, which is basically what it sounds like. How do we preserve wealth over the long haul? And so the global economy needs a currency to perform these functions as well. And because there's no global currency, national currencies sort of have to serve this function. And the dollar has basically been the world's preeminent international currency since the end of World War II. And so we're talking about now, right, 80 plus years of dominance in this space. And the numbers change over time, right, in terms of how reliant the world is on the dollar. But basically, to go to those three big roles and sort of try to give you a summary of what we're looking at here. We talk about the store of value role. What we're thinking about there in the global level or at the global level typically is what's called the reserve currency role. It is in what currency do states, do governments essentially store their surpluses from global trade and other global economic activity. So I'm China, I'm selling a lot of stuff to the world, I'm getting paid for those products. I have all this money left over, most likely dollars. And, how am I going to sort of keep that wealth for a rainy day in the future when I might need it? In the dollar, and specifically US dollar assets like treasury bonds, and this is essentially US government debt, that's the most popular instrument in which to store wealth, right? For central banks that manage countries' reserves. And the dollar today makes up around 57% of global reserves. So a little more than half. The next closest competitor is the euro, a little over 20%. And then after that, the remainder is comprised of around, seven or so other smaller currencies. So the dollar is far and away, right, the biggest slice of that pie. And that's been the case, again, going back 80 years or more. It was at its peak around the turn of the millennium. So the dollar was once as much as 71% of global reserves. And so it has declined a bit. In terms of trade and exports or pricing goods that we sell, around 55% or so of exports are priced in dollars. And around half of world trade is settled in dollars. Which means that when two countries not involving the United States buy and sell goods to each other, there's a pretty good chance that they're using America's currency to settle that deal, right, rather than their own currencies, which is pretty notable.
Got it. So we got about a minute here. That affords the American system a lot of privileges, right?
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is this is kind of an area for debate right now in a way that it hasn't been in the past. I think the typical viewpoint from economists, from policymakers, really dating back, at least, to the 1990s and probably even before that, is that dollar dominance is a net plus for the US. I think that's the general viewpoint. And there's lots of different reasons for that. The reserve role, should give the United States the ability to borrow more cheaply and more easily than it would if the dollar didn't play this role, for instance. And so that means the federal government can spend maybe more than it would if the dollar didn't have that position. There's other benefits as well. I think some of them we'll get into in our conversation today. There are some voices today that are starting to question that. Maybe we'll have time to talk about that later. And so you're hearing, including from within the Trump administration, some folks who are increasingly critical of dollar dominance. But again, I would say the conventional wisdom is still that it's a net plus.
Let's move on to our second question. The dependence on the dollar gives decision makers in Washington, D.C. extraordinary power to police other nations. Can you explain how financial sanctions actually work and how their use is increasing?
Absolutely, yeah. So this actually is a good segue from the previous question, because when we think about benefits of having issuing the world's dominant currency, one of the benefits, right, is this capacity to use financial sanctions, right? So one reason the United States has unrivaled ability to do this, or the main reason, I should say, the United States has unrivaled ability to use financial sanctions is because of the dollar's global role. So we discussed just a few moments ago, the dollar is used in about half of world trade, right? And so what that means is that businesses around the world, right, are dependent on having access to dollars, both to make payments, to buy things, and to receive payment for the things that they're selling. We could also talk about debt markets, right? The dollar is a very popular currency in which to issue debt, even outside of the United States. And so foreign firms, businesses, and even foreign governments borrow in US dollars, and therefore they need to have access to dollars to make payments to service their debt and not default, right? So the bottom line is, if you're a government, if you're a business or an individual, and you want to participate in the world economy, you need to have some access to the dollar, both as a means of, right, making payment or receiving payment for your various activities. And that means the United States has this enormous power, because turns out virtually all, not all, but virtually all, so somewhere on the order of 95, 96% of all dollars that move around the world are going to touch the United States in some way. And when I mean touch the United States, right, we know most of the dollars aren't physical. It's sort of wire transfers, digital movements of accounting. But that is going to be routed, that request to move money from one account in one part of the world to another account all the way over here in another part of the world. That is going to be routed through banks that have operations in the US. There's less than 50 of these big key banks that are part of something called the Clearinghouse Interbank Payment System. Short version of that is CHIPS, so it's a little easier to remember, right? CHIPS, there's less than 50 of these banks, and you can think of them, the way I like to describe it, as kind of like the big airport hubs. If you or I were going to travel, to some smaller American city or internationally, there's a good chance, right, that we're not going to get a direct flight to that place. And so what we're probably going to end up doing is having to connect in an airport hub, right? Maybe Atlanta, maybe O'Hare, wherever it is, right? That big airport hub is going to connect to lots of these smaller airports. And that's what these CHIPS banks do, right? They function as the big hubs of the global financial system. And they operate out of the US. And what that means is the United States government, specifically the Treasury Department, which largely manages US financial sanctions. And the Treasury Department acts at the request of the President of the United States, who can effectively impose sanctions with the stroke of a pen through issuing an executive order. This is how it's been working for decades. And so effectively what happens is the President can say, I want to sanction a particular business, I want to sanction a particular individual, I want to sanction a particular foreign government, whoever the target may be around the world for whatever reason, signs that executive order, that goes to the Treasury. The Treasury then reports to all those banks, all those big hubs in the United States, that this entity, individual, institution, business, whatever it is now added to the blacklist, essentially, what's called the Specially Designated Nationals list. That list is immediately persona non grata with those big banks. They can no longer do any business with that entity at the risk of facing major financial penalties, right? So these banks are going to self-enforce. They're going to follow whatever the Treasury tells them to do. Because if they're caught doing business on behalf of that foreign actor that is added to that list, they're gonna the individual involved could go to prison. The individual involved that sort of participates in sort of facilitating that payment would face major penalties into millions of dollars. The bank itself is going to be publicly shamed and humiliated and charged with billions potentially dollars in penalties. This has happened to banks that are both American banks and foreign banks that operate in the U.S. that have been caught essentially breaking sanctions law. And so the banks will just immediately say, you know what, sorry, we can't, make that debt payment for you, whoever the entity that's targeted, or we can't process that export payment for whatever it is that you're selling. The basic way that this then functions for the target is you're more or less cut out of the dollar system. And because the dollar is the world's most important currency, you're cut out of a lot of the global economy. And it makes it really difficult to engage in the same kinds of transactions that you need to keep your business alive or to enjoy the kind of lifestyle that you wanted to live if you were an oligarch or whatever it is that you use your bank, your international banking for.
So, final 15 seconds here. The use of sanctions has increased a lot, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, just in terms of the number of executive orders, one way to look at it, that's one way I count it in the book. In the year 2000, there was something on the order of 20 executive orders in place on sanctions. By 2023, that had increased to over 100. In terms of the number of countries targeted, and there's lots of entities within countries that are targeted, we've gone from that same period, 4 countries to over 20 countries that are targeted. And in terms of the actual number of individuals and entities, it's now over, I think, 10,000 on that blacklist that I mentioned before. So absolutely, it's increased a lot over the last quarter century.
Wow. Let's move on to our third question. The thesis of your book explores how other countries won't take these measures lying down. What are the options available for leaders who are targeted by American sanctions?
Absolutely. I mean, that's basically the premise of the book is to say, look, the United States has been using sanctions with increasing frequency, as we just discussed. And the more the United States does this, the more it's effectively raising concerns and awareness around the world that, hey, the dollar is a really convenient currency to use. There's a lot of economic appeal. There's a lot of reasons why, if I'm a business, I would want to use dollars, not least of which is that everybody else uses them, right? So, you all want to be in the same network. We all want to be on the same social network where everybody else is. We all want to be using the same currency that everybody else is. There's also cost advantages to the dollar. Usually it's cheaper because there's so much available, right? So many services offered in it. And yet, right, if you're an actor in a country that's, not on good terms with the United States, right? We can think of a lot of countries in this space. Russia, probably the first one that comes to mind right now. Iran would be another one, right? We can go on and on. Countries that have really rough patches of foreign relations, in some cases going back a long time. The dollar has that economic appeal, and yet politically it's quite risky because if you're using the dollar and you're dependent on the dollar for your business or for your activities, well, then the United States government can very easily, as we just described, use the dollar against you as a tool of coercion. Right, and this is what we've seen in the case of Russia over the last few years. It's what we've seen in the case of Iran going back a lot longer. It's what we've seen in the case of countries like Syria, Libya. We could go on and on. Countries that have found that despite the dollar's convenience, right, relying on the dollar is quite risky. So what are the options? That was your question. There's a handful of options, and it depends on what it is that you're worried about. One thing countries worry about is their reserves. We talked earlier, stored value rule. So I've got excess dollars from trade. I'm going to store that for a rainy day. How do I preserve that wealth, that value over time? Typically, I'm going to invest that in US dollar assets like US Treasury bonds. By loaning it to the US government, I hold that bond. If I need cash, I sell the bond, I get the dollars, I can use those dollars. Well, turns out that those dollars that I hold or those Treasury bonds that I hold are not in my own vault, right? They're actually in an account, probably with the New York Fed in the United States, which means that, again, the president can sign a executive order and block my access to those assets. Okay, so yeah, they're really attractive for, again, economic reasons, but for political reasons, I might lose the ability to liquidate those and turn them into cash when I need them, right? And if I'm worried about that, what are my alternatives? Well, the dollar isn't the only reserve currency in the world. The euro is another option. And so we might see countries move into that. We saw Russia do that a bit before the invasion. Turned out not to work well for them, but that was what they were doing. Gold is another option. Gold has become very popular over the last few years as a reserve asset. It used to be critical to the world monetary system. Uh, by the early 1970s, it didn't have an official role. It was declining. That has flipped in recent years. And we've seen big central banks, especially those concerned about sanctions, buying gold. In terms of payments, I think we'll talk more later about China, what China's doing. So I'll save that discussion because if you're worried about losing access to the banking system and the payments, the network that we were talking about earlier, your options are a little bit different. But countries are trying, the bottom line here, to figure out ways, right, to seek alternatives at minimum as a way to try to reduce the risk of being reliant on dollars.
Got it. Let's move on to our fourth question. You're right. We are going to talk about China here. Let's really dive deep into it. China has grown tremendously over the past few decades to now become America's chief rival. How has Beijing acted to challenge the authority of the US and try to sanction-proof its economy?
I mean, it's a huge question. I think China's, probably the most interesting country to discuss. Maybe the European Union we could talk about too. They're another interesting case because these are the two, kind of economic rivals to the U.S. Right? The only economic entities that come close to the U.S. economy size. Right? Your European Union and China. China, of course, uniquely positioned because, as you mentioned, right, their sort of adversarial relationship with the U.S. Whereas the European Union is largely viewed as a U.S. ally, and so it's a little different. So China, yes, is concerned about the possibility of facing sanctions. China's been increasingly worried about this over time, right? They watched the United States sanction Russia in 2014. Well, it was notable, right? Because the United States had usually gone after smaller countries like Burma, Syria, right? Smaller economies that were viewed as, rogue states or maybe failed states. Libya, we mentioned earlier. Russia's not that, right? Russia was, we could debate whether Russia's a great power. Certainly a former great power, 11th largest economy in the world, not a tiny country. Prior to those 2014 sanctions, Iran was the largest country that had been sanctioned, right? And so Russia's a big step up. China watches that 2014. Interesting. Maybe the United States is sort of changing the kinds of targets that it's willing to go after, right? Then 2018, the United States pulls out of the Iran nuclear deal. That bothered China, it bothered the Europeans, bothered a lot of people because it forced sanctions back on China and forced countries like China to reimpose sanctions as well because of what's called secondary sanctions. That bothered the Chinese as well. And then, of course, the sanctions in 2022 following the Russian invasion, which were much more severe than the ones imposed in 2014, even though there had been some escalation in the years between the annexation of Crimea and the invasion. The 22 sanctions were a big sort of slap across Russia's face. And again, the Chinese took note, right? Bottom line is the Chinese are saying, hey, there may come a crisis in the future where we're going to face these sanctions if we do something that runs against American interests and they want to use that as a coercive tool against us. So what is China doing? I mentioned gold earlier. China's been a big purchaser of gold, right? Still has US Treasuries, but it has slowed its purchases of US Treasury bonds. We can speculate about why that is. One theory is China doesn't want to have an over-reliance on dollars because the United States froze around $100 billion of Russian reserve assets, around 300 billion total. A lot of those were euro reserves. But the United States was participating in this as well. And so, hey, we probably don't want to have a ton of new treasury bonds if they're at risk of being frozen. The payment side, we want to come back to that. This is really the interesting area where China's doing more, and I think it's more important. And China, trades a lot. Its reliance on the global economy as an export market is critical, right, for its economy, for its businesses. And China historically has settled most of its trade in dollars. And again, it's taken those dollars and reinvested those back in treasury bonds. China's looking to reduce its reliance on the dollar. And so China has moved to use its own currency more in trade, right? Just like the United States does. The United States trades with other countries using the dollar. China's moving to become more like the United States in that regard. And so we've seen moves in that direction. Around 2017, a little more than 10% of China's trade was settled in its own currency. Now it's about a third of China's trade settled in its own currency. So it has had some success. And it's had this success by kind of creating its own financial network. I mentioned CHIPS earlier. China has something called CIPS, cross-border interbank payment system. It's small. It is not a dollar competitor. But what it can do, and what it seems to be doing, is helping China maintain, or I shouldn't say maintain, increase the use of the renminbi, China's currency, in its own bilateral trade. And that's what China really is worried about. I don't think it's trying to create a world where other countries are using its currency, just like other countries use the dollar. But I think it wants a world where at least it has a decent slice of its international economic activity being conducted in its own currency, which would mean China's less vulnerable to being cut off from the dollar like Russia was.
Got it. So, final minute here for this question. Is it working? Are they successful in their efforts, in your assessment?
Yeah, I mean they've absolutely had some success here, right? The question is how far do they want to take it, and how far can they take it without moving on certain reforms? So China's currency, a lot of the discussion around this centers on this debate of is China trying to take on the dollar? Does China want to topple the dollar? I think that's the wrong way to look at it because in my view they don't. I don't think China wants to be the world's reserve currency issuer, for instance, right? To be the world's dominant currency issuer for various reasons. There are costs that come to it. From China's perspective, one of those costs would be requiring China to really liberalize or open up its domestic financial markets to foreign investment, which would expose China's economy to instability that I think Xi Jinping sees as being too risky for China. Stability is really critical for the Chinese. So I think what we're seeing is incremental progress that is largely focused again on really just trying to reduce China's own personal risk, not compete with the dollar directly. And that's why I think we have the discussion on that point. You can say, yes, they're making progress. Does that mean I think the renminbi is going to topple the dollar? Absolutely not. I don't think that is at all the goal or likely.
Let's move on to our final question. Although your book highlights the preeminent position of the dollar, other nations are able to mitigate the political risks associated with sanctions. How can American policymakers be more mindful of their use of this economic weapon?
It's a big question. This is where you get to the point in the book or where you say, okay, what are the policy implications of what I'm talking about? And that's you certainly want to have something to say on that because even if you learn something from your research, what is it that can be changed moving forward? So from the perspective of the U.S. government, if they view this as a problem, and I think it's become increasingly understood, especially by some at Treasury, that sanctions perhaps are being overused. So what are the implications of this, right? Especially if you want to preserve dollar dominance. And again, maybe some of the Trump administration don't feel that way. That's a different conversation because this is becoming more debated. But let's say we stick to the traditional view that it's good and therefore it's something that you want to protect. What do you do? So the first thing you do is you probably say, like, we have other tools in our toolkit that we can and should use. And so every problem doesn't necessarily have to require a sanction to try to solve it, right? I think in a lot of these cases, sanctions are used symbolically as a way to signal U.S. Disapproval. So there might be allegations of human rights abuses, which are very serious, and the United States has I think a responsibility to respond to in some ways. There are various ways you can respond, right? Doesn't always have to be through imposing financial sanctions, right? So in other words, limiting the number of reasons you're willing to sort of impose the sanctions penalty, and perhaps sort of shrinking that universe of cases when you want to use it. The second thing is to act multilaterally. The Biden administration's approach to the Russia sanctions is, I think, a good case of good sanctions design in that when you're working with other countries, especially the Europeans, what that does is it doesn't just mean the dollar is being politicized. The euro was politicized as well, right? And what that did is it didn't just sort of hurt the dollar's appeal from a geopolitical perspective. It also made the euro less attractive and less appealing for those reasons for a small subset of countries, which is important. You don't want to just sort of stigmatize the dollar. You want to work with other countries. It also makes the sanctions more effective, right? So that's a bigger reason. But in terms of preserving the dollar's sort of appeal, I think working with the Europeans in particular is critical when we can. And then lastly, not using sanctions piecemeal in these small ways. I look at the Russia case and I say, boy, the United States imposed some smaller financial sanctions in 2014, then again in 2015, then again in 2016, then again in 2018, then again in 2019, and then in 22 and 23. This sort of slow rollout of sanctions, I think, one, it makes sanctions less effective because it gives states the time to adapt. And that's the second part of it is when you're doing it in this way, you're making that awareness in that foreign capital, in the case of Moscow here, increasingly aware of what you're up to and what the risks are. And that's going to provoke the kinds of de-dollarization responses that the book tries to document. So I think it's better, to use sanctions less, and when you use them, to be willing to sort of go in at a higher level. I think that makes the sanctions more effective because you're much more likely to impose the high costs that might change a target's behavior, like Russia, without triggering the sort of longer term trends to minimizing Russia's exposure or the target's exposure, which is what we've seen in this case.
Great, Daniel. That has been 5 questions. You've answered them amazingly in the 5 minutes we've given you. Let's move on to our bonus questions. So Daniel, you're a political science professor. How did you get to that position? What is your background?
Well, as an undergrad, I majored in political science, so I've always had an interest in politics. Made the decision in part from a recommendation from a professor to get a PhD, which probably wasn't the smartest thing to do. It's not necessarily a smart path for everybody. In my case, I'm fortunate it worked out. So I did my doctoral work at University of Virginia. While I was there, financial crisis was going on. That's a big reason why I got really interested in global finance and the dollar's role. Got interested in China's currency internationalization around that same time because China responded to the crisis by trying to promote the use of the renminbi. Wasn't really thinking about sanctions then. That came a little bit later, but that's kind of a quick summary of the path.
Got it. Our second bonus question for you, Daniel, is what is an accomplishment that you are most proud of?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. In terms of
has your work found their way into the hands of Treasury officials?
I've talked to a few folks at Treasury who these are not the most high-ranking folks, more folks on the research side, who, yes, I know have read the book or at least parts of the book and have communicated with me about it. And so that's pretty cool. I had the opportunity to testify before Congress in 2023, which was a pretty cool honor and a pretty cool experience. So those probably come to mind. Yeah.
Got it. And our final bonus question for you, Daniel, what are you working on next?
Working on a project right now on sanctions in Russia, actually with a co-author, where we're trying to look at how Russian citizens responded to sanctions in terms of their interest in holding dollars as a store of value. So now we're not thinking at the international role, but at the domestic level role, citizens of foreign countries also hold dollars because they view it as a safe asset in which to hold their savings. And so we're looking at how the sanctions affected individual Russians to respond to that, which is, I think, a pretty fascinating topic.
Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. Daniel is the author of Bucking the Buck, and I definitely recommend that you check it out. Daniel, how can our listeners reach out to you, or where can they find you?
See, I'm on X at Daniel_McDowell. I'm on Blue Sky. I don't know my full Blue Sky handle, but it's basically the same thing. If you just search for Daniel McDowell, I'm there. So those are probably the 2 easiest places to interact with me. You can obviously Google me and find me on Syracuse website as well. So
amazing. Thank you so much for joining us on Books
Thanks
in
so
5.
much for having me. My pleasure.
The host of Books in 5 is Bhavan Sodhan. Books in 5 is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.